The excavation crew filled in the second hole first, the one that had actually found the leak, tamping fresh earth down over a repaired section of pipe roughly 2 miles from where everyone had originally been told to dig. Esme Calder stood at the edge of the site watching them work, the particular quiet satisfaction of a problem finally, completely closed, and thought, not for the first time that month, about how close this specific stretch of prairie had come to a considerably worse ending than a patch of disturbed grass that would be green again by next spring. The morning had the specific stillness of early autumn on open ground, low sun throwing long shadows off the excavation equipment, a handful of pronghorn watching the whole operation from a respectful distance the way local wildlife had learned to do across decades of pipeline maintenance work crossing their range. Esme had walked this exact stretch of corridor probably 200 times across her career, on foot inspections, routine surveys, the ordinary rhythm of a job that mostly consisted of nothing happening, which was, she'd come to understand early on, the entire point of the work, however unglamorous that made it sound at a dinner party. Trent hadn't come out to the site that day. He'd been out twice already that week, which was, for a CEO running a company with 14 other active pipeline segments to worry about, a genuinely significant amount of personal attention to give one repaired leak, and Esme understood exactly why without either of them needing to say it directly. 6 weeks earlier, this same stretch of ground had been the site of the wrong hole entirely, dug nearly 2 miles from where the actual leak sat, based on a location estimate neither of them had any reason to doubt at the time. The first excavation crew arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, 3 pieces of heavy equipment and a specialized team pulled off another job on 48 hours notice, working from FlowTrace triangulated leak location estimate, a tight 90-meter radius the system had calculated with what the dashboard described as 91% confidence. Esme was on site by 6:15, standing at the edge of the marked excavation zone with a printed copy of the acoustic analysis in her hand, the pressure wave arrival time data from the 2 nearest sensor stations, 12 miles apart, both timestamps agreeing closely enough that the triangulation math genuinely did look solid on paper. The crew foreman, a broad, unhurried man named Delroy who'd worked pipeline excavations for the better part of 2 decades, walked the marked boundary with her once before the equipment started moving, the particular ritual of 2 experienced people confirming they were about to dig in a spot that made sense to both of them before committing heavy machinery to the ground. 91% confidence, Esme, the field supervisor told her, not unkindly, more checking than challenging. You want us digging somewhere else instead? No. Dig here. The math sound, I just want eyes on it the whole way down, because sound math off bad assumptions still gives you a wrong answer with real confidence attached to it. They dug for 6 hours. They found undisturbed pipe, clean, dry, no leak, no sign one had ever passed through that stretch of ground, and Esme stood at the edge of that empty excavation feeling the specific, disorienting gap between a number that had looked completely trustworthy that morning and a hole in the ground that simply had nothing wrong with it. Esme had first flagged the pressure anomaly 2 days before the first crew ever broke ground, a slow, small drop in line pressure across the monitored segment that the automated system had registered but hadn't yet escalated past a routine maintenance flag, the kind of minor fluctuation that happened across this pipeline network several times a month for reasons ranging from temperature variance to a valve not seating perfectly on its last cycle. What made her look twice was the shape of the drop, not its size. A genuine leak produces a specific acoustic signature, a pressure wave propagating outward from the breach point in both directions along the pipe, arriving at monitoring stations on either side at times that, run through the right math, triangulate back to a location with real precision. She pulled the raw acoustic data herself rather than trusting only FlowTrace summary output, a habit she'd never fully explained to anyone at the company beyond a vague sense that raw data told you things a process number sometimes smoothed away without meaning to. She developed that particular habit early in her career, watching a mentor of her own spend an entire afternoon once explaining that a dashboard was always somebody's interpretation of a signal, however good the interpretation. And that the signal itself was the only thing that never lied on its own account. The waveform was there. Faint, but there, exactly the signature of a small, slow leak, and FlowTrace triangulation algorithm, running its standard calculation against the 2 nearest sensor stations, produced a location estimate with 91% confidence, a number that read, to anyone glancing at a dashboard, like something close to certainty. She sat with that number for a long moment before calling anyone, running her own quick mental check against everything she personally knew about that stretch of corridor, nothing obviously wrong jumping out, no recent construction work nearby, no known active concerns on file for that segment, the specific, false reassurance of a location that looked completely unremarkable on the surface. She called Trent that same afternoon, mostly out of habit, the two of them having spent enough years in each other's orbit that a genuine technical concern reflexively went to him before it went through any formal channel, a habit she knew, technically, sidestepped some of the company's own reporting structure, and one neither of them had ever seriously discussed changing, because it had never once produced a worse outcome than the formal channel would have. "I've got a probable leak signature, small, slow, Flowtrace is calling it at 91% confidence roughly 2 miles north of the Cutbank Junction. I want to get a crew out there fast, before whatever this is grows." 91's a strong number, Esme. Go. Flowtrace triangulation math works by calculating how long a pressure wave takes to travel from a leak's actual location to each of the sensor stations on either side of it, a calculation that depends, critically, on knowing the speed of sound through the specific pipe material and product at that exact point in the line, a value that Flowtrace treats, across the vast majority of this pipeline network, as essentially uniform, because the vast majority of this pipeline network genuinely is uniform, the same wall thickness, the same steel grade, installed in continuous runs decades ago and never meaningfully altered since. The stretch of pipe running through the actual leak's true location wasn't uniform. In 1987, a rupture caused by a construction crew's backhoe had required an emergency repair roughly 2.1 miles south of where Flowtrace algorithm eventually estimated this new leak to be, a repair that had replaced 11 meters of the original pipe with a slightly thicker walled section, standard practice for the era, fully documented in the original repair records, and acoustically almost invisible to a system built decades later that had never been specifically told to account for it. Sound travels at a very slightly different speed through that thicker walled section than through the original pipe surrounding it. Over 11 meters, that difference is genuinely negligible. Over the roughly 2 miles the pressure wave actually had to travel past that old repair before reaching the northern sensor station, the tiny per meter timing discrepancy compounded into an arrival time error large enough to shift Flowtrace's triangulated location estimate by nearly 2 full miles from the leak's actual position, an error the algorithm's uniform material assumption had no way to detect or correct for, because it had never been told that section of pipe wasn't uniform in the first place. It's a genuinely strange kind of error to sit with, once you understand it fully, the idea that a repair completed cleanly and correctly decades ago, a job that had, by every measure the industry cared about at the time, simply fixed a problem and moved on, could still be quietly distorting a calculation built long after everyone involved in that original repair had likely moved on to other jobs, other companies, some of them probably retired or passed on entirely by the time their 11 meters of slightly thicker pipe finally mattered again in a way nobody could have anticipated. Esme had actually raised a version of this exact concern with Trent almost 3 years earlier, not about this specific repair, which she didn't yet know would matter, but about the broader principle, during a routine quarterly review that had otherwise been about budget planning for the following year's inspection schedule. Flowtrace assumes uniform acoustic properties across every segment, Trent. This network's got decades of old repairs, patches, replaced sections, all documented somewhere in maintenance records nobody's ever formally fed into the triangulation model. I don't think that's a hypothetical gap. I think it's sitting in our own archives right now, waiting for exactly the wrong leak to land near exactly the wrong old repair. How many documented material anomalies are we talking about, across the whole network? I don't know exactly. Dozens, at minimum, across 60 years of repair history. I haven't had time to compile the full list myself. Compile it, and I'll get engineering to look at building it into the model. I can't prioritize integrating data we don't have organized yet, Esme. That's not me saying no, that's me saying I need the actual list before I can ask anyone to do anything with it. She'd started the compilation. She hadn't finished it, 3 years later, a project that kept losing priority against more immediately pressing work, the specific, familiar erosion of an important but not urgent task against a queue of things that were urgent every single week, a folder on her computer she opened every few months with genuine intention and closed again an hour later once something louder demanded her actual attention. The first crew found nothing at the 91% location. Esme stood at the edge of that empty hole for a long moment before she said anything, running through the same mental checklist she always ran when a confident number turned out wrong. Was the underlying data bad, was the model's assumption wrong, or had she simply misread something herself? Delroy waited beside her without pushing, the particular patience of a man who'd worked alongside enough engineers to recognize when someone needed a minute of silence more than they needed a question. "The waveform's real," she said, mostly to herself, pulling the raw acoustic data back up on her tablet right there at the excavation site. "The leak's real. The location's wrong." She spent the next 4 hours doing something Flowtrace's own interface had never been built to make easy, manually walking the triangulation math backward, testing what would happen to the location estimate if she assumed a different acoustic velocity for some unknown stretch of pipe between the two sensor stations, essentially asking the question the algorithm itself had never been designed to ask: what if the pipe between here and there isn't actually uniform? She worked through it sitting on the open tailgate of her truck, laptop balanced on her knees, Delroy's crew standing down nearby with the specific patient boredom of people paid by the hour who genuinely didn't mind waiting, occasionally one of them wandering over to glance at her screen full of numbers that meant nothing to them and everything to her. She didn't have an answer that afternoon. She had a hypothesis, and a stack of old maintenance records back at the office that might, if she went looking specifically for material property anomalies along this exact corridor, actually confirm it. The maintenance archive room hadn't been meaningfully reorganized in at least a decade, filing cabinets full of repair records going back to a period before most of this data had ever been digitized, fluorescent lights humming overhead in the specific way old office lighting always seemed to, and Esme spent that evening working through folders by hand, cross-referencing dates and mile markers against the corridor where the leak's true signature had to be hiding somewhere between the two sensor stations that had disagreed with reality. The work was tedious in a way that had nothing to do with difficulty and everything to do with volume, folder after folder of decades-old repair documentation, most of it entirely irrelevant to her search, occasional gems of institutional history she found herself pausing over anyway, a 1974 report about a different leak entirely, a hand-drawn diagram from an engineer whose name she didn't recognize, the accumulated paper memory of a company that had been running pipe through this stretch of prairie for longer than either she or Trent had been alive. She found the 1987 repair record a little before 9 that night, a faded typed report describing an emergency backhoe strike, an 11-meter section replacement, wall thickness specifications that differed meaningfully from the surrounding original pipe. She sat on the floor of that archive room with the folder open across her knees, running the numbers by hand against a napkin's worth of scratch math, and felt the specific, quiet certainty of a hypothesis finally clicking into a shape she could actually defend, the particular satisfaction that never quite translates into words when you try to explain it to someone who wasn't there for the 4 hours of dead ends that came before it. She called Trent again, considerably later than their usual working hours, and could hear, in the slight delay before he answered, that she'd probably woken him. "I found it. A 1987 emergency repair, different wall thickness, sitting right in the acoustic path between our two sensor stations. If I run the triangulation math accounting for that repair's different sound velocity instead of assuming uniform pipe, the corrected leak location comes out almost exactly 2 miles south of where the first crew dug." "You're saying Flowtrace's location estimate was wrong specifically because of one documented repair from decades before the system existed?" "I'm saying it was wrong because nobody ever told the system that repair existed, Trent. The data was sitting in a filing cabinet the whole time. I want a second crew out there at first light, at the corrected location, and I want us treating this as urgent, because that leak's been growing unaddressed for at least an extra day now while the first crew dug in the wrong spot. The second crew found it within 90 minutes of breaking ground at the corrected location, a genuine active leak, small but clearly no longer as small as it had likely been 2 days earlier, product visibly seeping into the surrounding soil in a pattern that confirmed, without any remaining ambiguity, exactly the kind of slow structural failure the original acoustic signature had first flagged. Delroy's crew moved quickly once they'd confirmed the find, the specific efficient calm of people who'd handled genuine leaks before and knew exactly how much of that first hour actually mattered. Trent arrived on site himself a little after the discovery, standing at the edge of the correctly located excavation with Esme, both of them looking at a problem that had cost the company an extra day, an unnecessary excavation 2 miles in the wrong direction, and, more seriously, an extra day of unaddressed leak growth that a faster, correctly located response would have avoided entirely. He'd driven out himself rather than sending anyone else, still in the same clothes he'd apparently thrown on after her call the night before, and Esme noticed, without commenting on it, that he looked like a man who hadn't slept much either. An extra day, he said, more to himself than to her. Because a repair record from before either of us was born never made it into a system built decades later. I've known about the gap for 3 years, Trent. I never finished compiling the list I told you I'd compile. I want to own that part of this directly, because if I had, we might have had this exact repair flagged in the system already, and none of yesterday happens the way it happened. You also found it in 4 hours once you knew to go looking, working off nothing but a hunch in an archive room nobody's touched in years. I don't think the lesson here is that you should have moved faster 3 years ago on a task that kept losing priority against real, urgent work every single week. I think the lesson is that we built a system trusting a uniform pipe assumption across 60 years of infrastructure that was never actually uniform, and neither of us built in a mechanism to systematically close that gap before it mattered, instead of relying on someone eventually happening to go looking. I don't fully let myself off the hook that easily, Trent. I'm not asking you to let yourself off the hook. I'm telling you where I think the actual failure sits, and it's not in 3 years of a deprioritized side project. It's in a model we both signed off on that assumes something about 60 years of infrastructure history neither of us had any real reason to assume was true. They'd grown up 2 houses apart, in a small town built almost entirely around this pipeline company's original terminal, both their fathers having worked the same shift rotation for over 20 years before either Trent or Esme ever considered a career in the same industry themselves. They'd been inseparable as kids in the specific, uncomplicated way small-town childhood sometimes produce, the same treehouse, the same bikes, the same summer jobs at the same terminal once they were old enough, and had gone in genuinely different directions after high school, Trent into business school and eventually back into the company's leadership track, Esme into a mechanical engineering program and eventually into field integrity work, the two of them reconnecting professionally almost a decade later when Trent, newly promoted to CEO, had specifically recruited her back to the company he now ran. She remembered that recruiting conversation clearly, the two of them meeting for coffee in a city neither of them had grown up anywhere near, Trent laying out his plans for the company with the specific mixture of nervous energy and genuine conviction she recognized from watching him talk himself into things since they were both about 9 years old. She'd taken the job partly for the work itself and partly, she'd admit if asked directly, because working somewhere with Trent already understanding exactly how she thought felt like a genuine advantage in a field where being taken seriously as a woman doing physically demanding field work still required more convincing than it should have, in rooms full of people who hadn't known her since she was 9. Neither of them talks about that friendship much at work, mostly because it's simply always been there, a fact of both their lives rather than a topic either one needs to actively manage. It matters here mainly because it's part of why a 4-hour hunch in an archive room reached the CEO's phone the same night, rather than working its way up through several layers of a reporting structure that might have taken considerably longer than 4 hours to move, and part of why neither of them found it strange, that morning at the correctly located excavation, to have an unusually direct conversation about blame that most CEOs and most field engineers would probably have handled through a considerably more formal channel. The repair got completed within 8 days of the correct location being found, a genuinely fast turnaround for a fix that included both the physical pipe replacement and a full engineering review of the surrounding acoustic conditions, a review that confirmed the corrected math held up against direct physical inspection once the section was actually exposed. What took considerably longer, and what Esme considers the more important part of the whole episode, was the project she'd started and never finished 3 years earlier, now fully completed and fully integrated. Every documented material anomaly across 60 years of repair history for this entire pipeline network, every replaced section, every different wall thickness, every patch that might alter acoustic velocity even slightly, got compiled, digitized, and fed directly into Flowtrace's triangulation model as a standing correction layer. Work that took a dedicated team of 4 people the better part of 5 months to complete properly, cross-referencing thousands of pages of decades-old paper records against a modern digital map of the entire network mile by mile. Esme sat in on most of that team's weekly progress meetings herself, not because anyone required it of her but because she'd been the one to first understand exactly what shape the gap took, and she felt, watching 4 people methodically close it over 5 months. A specific satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with simply seeing a known problem actually get fixed properly rather than patched around. I keep thinking about the version of this where that leak had been larger to begin with, Trent told her, close to the end of that 5-month project, the two of them reviewing the final integrated dataset together in his office, late enough in the evening that most of the building's other lights were already off. Or slower to show up in the acoustic signature at all. An extra day cost us an excavation and some soil remediation. A different leak, a different location, that same extra day could have cost considerably more than that. I think about that too. I think the actual lesson isn't really about this one leak, though. It's that we built a genuinely sophisticated system on top of 60 years of infrastructure history, and sophistication in the model was never going to make up for the parts of that history nobody had gotten around to formally telling it about yet. I don't disagree. I also don't think either of us fully reckons yet with how many more of those gaps are probably still sitting in some other archive room we haven't gone looking in. No, Esme said. I don't think we do either. Esme watched the crew finish tamping down the last of the fresh earth over the correctly repaired section, 6 weeks and one very long project after a small, slow leak had first shown up as an unremarkable pressure fluctuation nobody would have thought twice about if she hadn't happened to pull the raw waveform herself instead of trusting the summary number alone. She still pulls raw acoustic data on every flagged anomaly, a habit that predates Flowtrace and will likely outlast it, though the practice carries less weight now that the model itself finally accounts for the specific kind of gap that sent a crew digging 2 miles in the wrong direction on a cold morning 6 weeks ago. She thinks, sometimes, about the unfinished version of that compilation project sitting in a folder on her computer for 3 years, not because she still feels particularly guilty about it, that feeling faded somewhere in the middle of the 5-month fix, but because it's become the specific example she reaches for now whenever anyone on her team wants to deprioritize something important but not urgent in favor of whatever's loudest that week, a story she tells new hires now the same way. She suspects other veteran engineers on other pipelines somewhere are telling their own versions of the same lesson learned the hard way. Delroy's crew loaded the last of their equipment onto a flatbed as the morning wound down, the specific unceremonious end of a job that had, 6 weeks earlier, briefly threatened to become something considerably more serious than a patch of disturbed grass and an excavation 2 miles from where it needed to be. Esme shook Delroy's hand before he climbed into his truck, the same brief, practical goodbye they'd exchanged at the end of dozens of jobs across the years, neither of them needing to say anything more about how this particular one had gone. Trent still calls her directly when something genuinely urgent comes up, the same reflex that's outlasted both their childhoods and both their careers so far, and she still answers on the first or second ring, mostly out of the same decades-old habit, though she's noticed, in the months since, that those calls carry a slightly different weight now than they used to. Less, solve this fast, and more, tell me honestly what else might be sitting in an archive room somewhere, a question neither of them expects to fully finish answering anytime soon, across a pipeline network that's been quietly accumulating documented, undigitized history for the better part of 60 years, long before either of them existed to eventually go looking for it. She drove back toward the office that afternoon along the same corridor she'd driven 100 times before, past the exact stretch of prairie where 2 holes, 6 weeks and 2 miles apart, had briefly become the most important thing in either her or Trent's life, and thought, not unkindly, about how much of this job had always come down to exactly that, trusting a number enough to act on it fast, and trusting your own 2 hands and a filing cabinet enough to question it the moment the ground itself told you something the number hadn't.